Hello, everybody, and welcome to the session Approaching the Metaverse. My name is Dirk, and I appreciate your time. This is a pretty dense talk, and things will move quickly. Feel free to reach out via the meeting channels, and I'll make sure to answer your questions. This is what I do, or at least how we like to show it. I work for Microsoft on a strategic development and acceleration of the Metaverse, specifically working around the Internet of Things and mixed reality. And to make this clear from the start, I want to have some fun with this talk, so while I do work for Microsoft, ideas and opinions in this talk are my own, and I do not speak for the company. I have been in the space for around 15-ish years, working on the brand and experience side of things in, for example, AAA games, then digital retail, theme parks, hotels, casinos, but I also worked on the enterprise and industry side of things on mobility, manufacturing, logistics, and fashion. The best way to describe my work is that I help clients explore potential futures, understand the impact, identify desirable futures, and then make those actionables with roadmaps, milestones, and clear next steps. Today, I want to talk about 3 things that will explore different ways to approach the metaverse. First, why the metaverse as a concept is confusing and why defining it is sometimes even more confusing. Then I want to get to show a number of approaches how to define the space. And finally, I want to get into some design considerations based on that, specifically around identity and relationships. Let's start by outlining what the metaverse is, according to the news you probably read this morning. So the metaverse is 3D avatars, it's immersive meetings, collectibles, VR games, content creation, entertainment, and all of that is kind of true. But it doesn't really capture the possibilities and overall spirit, it just talks about specific aspects and technologies. And then you look at the next 10 articles where NFTs are scams, crypto is pretty much a Ponzi, and by the way, Facebook's metaverse is looking like a dystopia. And that might also kind of be true in many ways, but it's really not helpful. It's just the flip side, turning hype into hysteria. The problem here really is that the term is artificially broken down into individual technologies and narratives. So some groups attach the term to specific technologies, for example, virtual reality, augmented reality, blockchain, usually because they're investing or working on those technologies. Others see it as a future vision or narrative because they subscribe to the respective ideology. In other words, the term metaverse is largely driven by financial incentives and stakeholders. They spend a lot of time telling you that their version of the metaverse is the real one. So none of this is really helpful. The way the metaverse is currently used by media, analysts, and sadly by us in the industry, is not really helping to provide clarity on what the metaverse is, what it will enable, and the specific opportunities. We're cherry picking to shout either overly positive projections or horrible hysteria into the void. And while all might have a grain of truth, it doesn't really reflect what's going on in the space. So, let's talk a little bit about ways to find meaning in the term metaverse. Remember when I've said I've been doing this for quite a while now? Well, besides the metaverse becoming a hype now, it's been around for a very long time. Only previously we mostly talked about virtual worlds. Let me explain. Fundamentally, virtual worlds are all systems where people act within a platform, spatially or contextually, interacting with a platform and with each other. It defines your identity in a world, this is you and your representation. It locates you contextually, this might be your location or other things like time or membership. It allows you to interact with the system based on your identity and context, and others can see that interaction, likewise you can see theirs. Do you do all these? Congratulations, you run a virtual world. And at first glance, this covers platforms from multi-user dungeons, which are essentially text-based MMOs, to 3D MMOs like World of Warcraft, but also multi-user shooters like Fortnite, and also sandboxes and collaborative spaces like Minecraft. But in 2006, a lot of smart people got invited to an exercise in the Institute for the Future to explore paths into a 3D metaverse. Essentially, they wanted to know what happens when virtual and real collide. And this is the model they came up with. And again, in 2006, they looked at what was back then virtual worlds and divided them into 2 dimensions. based on identity-focused, where individuals look outward, and world-focused, where the world looks at individuals. And then real worlds versus constructed worlds. And virtual worlds, they said, are platforms where virtual identities explore virtual maps. And this is what we just talked about. A virtual character running around in a virtual meeting room, or in Azeroth in World of Warcraft, or a map in Fortnite or Minecraft. You know, the early examples. But then they realized, if you swap out the virtual map of the world with a map of the real world, then you get something else. You get mirror worlds. And these are platforms containing virtual models or reflections of the real, constructed through the use of, for example, the Internet of Things or digital twins. For example, by digitally mapping the real world with Google Cars to create a simulated map of the real world that you can now explore. Or you can add other data on these real maps, for example, the locations of cars, and then you end up with, for example, Uber and the ability to call upon a car. Or you might map a factory and then use it to create experiences like safety trainings while not being physically in the factory. Technically and conceptually, they realized both quadrants are the same thing. In one case, you move around a fictional map and the other one on a real map. But you can also get rid of the map entirely and project everything onto reality. And of course, in this scenario, you act as yourself, as the real person moving around in reality. You can now look at the digital representation of your factory and see the mirror world data on your actual machines, or get directions in your logistics hub or virtual see inside packages. Again, this is the same thing. You just switched the map data, or rather, you scaled the real world map data to one-to-one size and aligned it to the viewport of the user. And finally, they realized for the last quadrant, they cannot only augment the map and the real world, but also the representation of the individual. And in 2006, live logging became a thing, and today we know people augmenting themselves into characters as social media influencers. So this includes the whole social space, but also platforms like work portals. It doesn't really matter if these social platforms are private, professional, or for entertainment or work. Technically and conceptually, again, they're the same thing. You just moved from augmenting the world to augmenting the image, or rather different aspects of a real person. And again, these quadrants work in a work or industrial context as well as a private context. You're really using these quadrants for gaming, navigation, social media. You can think of all of these as contextual, transparent multi-user systems. So yeah, these attributes describe Minecraft and Google Maps and Pokemon Go and Facebook, and pull them all into the metaverse. Really, the only difference between Minecraft and Google Street View is that one map is based on a fictional world and the other one is on a real one. The only difference between Uber and Pokemon Go is the type of things they spawn on their maps. And Twitter is pretty much any massive multiplayer game, but they only bothered to develop the chat part. And it's important to appreciate what that actually means. The Metaverse roadmap detached the Metaverse concept from a specific modality or device like VR. And it said, what remains is the question, for a specific moment, for a specific task, what is the best quadrant to transport a specific experience? And you can think of these as user journeys with different touch points. Maybe it's an experience that starts within one quadrant, but then moves between them as the use case unfolds. But even more importantly, we can look at the requirements for such metaverses and eventually end up at the requirements for virtual worlds. But let's take a step back and look at another approach. Another way to look at the metaverse is, well, to actually look at it. A future vision is something that hasn't existed as a real product yet. However, the concept and principle is known and understood and accepted on a society level. Like, for example, pop culture artifacts like books or movies are usually a large driver of those visions. And they will inevitably inspire and influence public expectations and thus investors and the end product. So to understand the metaverse further, it might be interesting to look at those visions. And these are just 3 examples. You can find a lot of them on YouTube. They're very similar. But if you look at these videos, you can think about what kinds of technologies do they show? In which of those metaverse quadrants would you see these scenarios? And looking at these visions, most of them show a world where digital augmentation reaches into the physical world, where all four quadrants are used, sometimes jumping from one to the other. And that makes sense since no trend and no vision, and indeed none of these metaverse quadrants can exist in isolation. Pop culture is influenced by technology and also influences technology. And one way to look at this is to imagine that technology, society, and environments behave a little bit like pressure, temperature, and volume in a gas. If you change one of them, the others have to change too. For example, if you go to the moon, literally, the environment will be very different and you need new technologies, but also likely new forms of society if you want to stay there safely. And if new technologies come along, like in the Industrial Revolution, societies will change, but it also has an effect on environments, for example, city planning and mobility. And this is why visions like Ready Player One won't happen, because the metaverse won't be isolated within just one paradigm or quadrant or modality. It doesn't make sense to have this advanced technology in one aspect of your life, but not in any other. Like, this society has cheap, readily available, high-end VR virtual worlds, but no affordable robot vacuum cleaners or shelves? It's a nice approach to fiction as a narrative device, just not a realistic one. That picture would be like smartphones evolving to exactly the iPhone 13, but then you can only use them when you're sitting at home. And the most popular game is to see who can sit down the fastest and they get a virtual chair or something. It doesn't make sense. Progress in one aspect of the metaverse technologies will also affect and enable all the other aspects and technologies. And these visions show that progress across all those four quadrants. And looking at them, you can ask questions like, how do people interact with technology? What kind of societies do these people live in? And what does this mean for the environments they live in? But looking closer at these visions, it creates another interesting question. Mostly, where does this data actually come from? How is it collected? And if this data represents the state of the real world, what will happen if you interact with that data in a virtual world? What if you change a value? Does that change in a virtual propagate into the real world? And what will happen if you change data representing other people? And those kind of questions are usually associated with the paradigm of ambient computing, meaning the digitalization of physical space. Remember when I talked in the beginning about digital experiences in retail, hotels, casinos, cities, industries? All of that is being subsumed by the metaverse right now. And that makes it even more complicated. I'm sorry. At this point, the best definition seems to include two huge megatrends, each with dozens of large subtrends and even more moving parts. So maybe let's take another step back. Virtual worlds, even like in the 80s and 90s, very early realized that they are not imaginary, that people bring real-world value along when they enter them. As Richard Bartle wrote in his book Designing Virtual Worlds in 2006, real is what isn't, imaginary is which isn't, but virtuality is kind of in between. Technically, it doesn't really exist, but it carries the real-world value. He realized when entering virtual worlds, we didn't bring a bit of the virtual to the real at all. We brought all of reality into the virtual. And then Rev Costa observed that there is a point where there is so much real-world value within the virtual that they cannot be meaningfully separated anymore. Shut down the virtual and reality won't work for some organizations or individuals anymore. Like some modern organizations can't exist without their digital resources. And if that happens on a society scale, at this point, the metaverse as a concept will emerge. And the metaverse is really all of this and more, spanning from people to things to environments to worlds, regardless of being fully virtual, digital, physical, and fully physical. But if it really is all that, how can this lead to a coherent system? And the answer is it probably won't. And that's fine. After all, GeoCities was the first big glimpse of the web, and it was kind of messy, but also really awesome. It was the entry point for a lot of people. It allowed everybody to have their first voice on the web, be creative, have fun, maybe a little bit atrocious design, but it paved the way for the web we now know. The point is, the first step in understanding the true potential of the metaverse is to give up on trying to artificially create a moat around your specific precious definition of the metaverse and allow some chaos and blinking text. It won't be just one thing or the other. VR or AR, headsets or phones, real or virtual, trustless or lawyers. The answer will be yes. It's confusing, I understand, but that also means it's diverse and fun and full of opportunity. So, as I said, the attempt at defining the metaverse might be confusing, so let's talk about specific things that will emerge in the metaverse, specifically around identity and relationships. The most important thing to understand is that identity is weird. This is how people usually think about identity. This is you and your representation, and then here are your virtual accounts that you have. But in reality, though, it's a little bit more complicated. The accounts are not the important thing. It's that you behave differently, that you represent yourself differently, that you act differently in different contexts. I mean, look at yourself. You don't want to transfer your personality between contexts. For example, bringing your Instagram personality to your work portal. You have an understanding that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. You're usually mindful with friend circles that you bring together, and you leave your sexual kinks at home when you're going to your grandma's birthday party. So it's socially expected behavior to display and omit certain aspects of your identity based on different contexts. And that makes the question, what even is identity, rather messy when you expect to act within a multitude of contexts that can be switched in an instant. And especially hard when you talk about transferring such identities and their representations between metaverse contexts. Also, based on a lot of research, we know that virtual worlds are used for identity experimentation and exploration. That's kind of the point. Richard Bartle was an early proponent of this, having studied the motivations of players since the early 90s. So it's actually more like this, where some of your representations are pushing the boundaries of who you are, maybe making you a little bit uncomfortable, but also inspiring you to be more and essentially growing who you are as a person. And since we're talking about virtual worlds, digital avatars are very descriptive. They're expressive and deliberate digital representations of self. And they also need to change based on context. Your work 3D avatar is different from your Nintendo Mii, is different from your EVE Online Corp CEO, is different from your Final Fantasy healer. Since exploration is such a huge theme, people will explore and do already explore gender, race, sex, culture, body types, even human nature itself in these platforms. So there are many, many, many layers to your identity, not just certain areas, but also how you see yourself within these areas, how you behave in them, and how you act them out. With avatars, every external attribute is changeable and merely temporary, and they're completely fluid. But this is also challenging a lot of current assumptions. Is choosing a female character as a male player weird in a work environment? Is choosing a dark skin tone as a white player digital blackfacing? If my avatar is stylized as Asian, is it cultural appropriation? And if I choose an Asian avatar, can I make Asian jokes and imitate an Asian accent? How about choosing races that don't exist in reality? Can I even appropriate Galenta culture in EVE or Lalafell culture in Final Fantasy? But these questions will be asked soon, as this avatar and identity thing is already charging into the mainstream, like with avatar talent shows. And here's a prediction for you. Soon one generation wants to talk about digital yellow face in VTubing, and the other generation won't even understand the problem, since skin color is simply an RGB value you can change at any time in your avatar. And currently nobody drives this home quite like Code Miko. Miko on the left is a virtual character puppeteered by Yuna Kang, aka the technician on the right. Besides her Twitch stream being really quite entertaining, both push the boundaries of what is technically possible and what is currently socially accepted. Twitch chat being able to change the size of body parts and body functions is just the beginning here. And she has been banned from Twitch multiple times for breaking the conventions of what was considered acceptable behavior. And you may feel like laughing about this, but you must not make the mistake and disregard these concerns. The cultural subtext we bring from reality into these virtual worlds is important and must be respected. But at the same time, we cannot avoid this conflict as designers, as we want to allow users the room for exploration to grow their identities. And in virtual world design, there's a concept called the magic circle. Oversimplified, it means that we design the experience. We also need to intentionally create boundaries for these explorations. Everything within these boundaries is the designed behavior. Everything in the circle is allowed. Everything outside the circle is either discouraged or in extremer cases punished. We have to understand that we as designers need to be mindful creating these boundaries and also recognize the need to design governance into these spaces. The metaverse is where real people interact with each other, usually using real-world resources, and thus everything of consequences is in fact real. Identity, emotions, values. But as the setting is virtual, it provides users a safe environment to go beyond what they currently are. So in a way, metaverses are machines to stimulate identity exploration and individual growth and understanding in people. But just keep in mind that some want to explore their deepest, darkest, most violent desires. And while that's fine too, we should not mix intentions. With all of that in mind, let's talk about relationships. Let's start with Razorfish's law that everything that in some form can be digital will eventually be digital, with even the most mundane thing turning smart. And this means that more and more things will capture digital information, creating more and more dense mirror worlds. Today, we usually talk about digital twins acting as virtual representations of real things in virtual dimensions. There is a direct connection between the real and the virtual to the point where changes in one is propagating to the other. And of course, propagate into other metaverse scenarios and quadrants as well. But that also means that via these mirror worlds, things and places can also react to users, be it proactive or reactive. And computational graphs allow to generate personalized scenarios based on that context. And this applies to virtual, physical, and mixed environments. Here's an example by Mercedes-Benz. So it's an advertising. People getting into their car, and as soon as the car knows who they are, it would personalize itself based on the driver and the passengers. But beyond that, how about the car knowing how you slept by getting the data from your health and fitness app? Recognizing that you don't feel well, recognizing that you have an important meeting in your calendar coming up, could and should all that influence the seat setting, the temperature, the ride softness? It probably could. But as soon as we do so, strange things are happening when digitally enhanced objects interact with us in a direct, embedded, and relatable way. Here are two examples, one very low-tech and one very high-tech. By displaying some form of personality, things become relatable. They develop character. And we as humans are wired to anthropomorphize vaguely intelligent entities, especially if we don't understand them fully. We do it with pets, but also inanimate objects like dolls or cars, and we give them names and plead with them if they don't work, and sometimes form those weird rituals around them. So, what would happen if the object could actually sense the environment, is aware of the context, and is able to understand and engage and interact with people? Well, we know what will happen because we have seen this in Jibo. Marketed as a social home robot, it was designed to use relationship as the interface, and people started throwing birthday parties for it, taking it on vacations, bringing it to their graduation. In other words, if your interface is a personality, then the user experience is a relationship. And that leads to use cases like this. This is not an animation, but an actual product. Moxie is a robot used in social therapy to help kids with anxiety and autism by forming an actual human-thing relationship. For brands, this means something very powerful. You can now shape the experience you want people to have with your products. Going back to the Mercedes-Benz example, what do you think the personalities of these two car models should be? They do not look the same, and they certainly do not drive the same, so why should they have the same personalities? In the real world, why should their digital assistant or driver assistants and autonomous systems drive the same? In virtual worlds, why should their digital representations behave the same? And we as users will project certain expectations based on embodiment of brands. So those parameters have to be carefully designed to not alienate users, and as well as to promote and foster actual relationships between users and products and thus brands. And this is what I call relationship design. It means training things around brand values and identities. And that goes for the personality and tonality of the object, as well as the behavior, regardless in which metaverse quadrant. You will not be able to sensibly separate physical product design and digital product design and product support and branding and marketing in this scenario. And relationship matters regardless if they live in physical space or digital space. But also, let's get this back to identity. There's a simple but often overlooked dynamic. Users can identify with things as well. And as the metaverse allows me to also augment my identity, things can be avatars as well. So what happens if I am the car? Not own it, but if it's my representation, if I identify as car. Remember brand avatars? Congratulations. Everybody can now be your brand by wearing your brand identity and products. And this matters because as they run through virtual worlds representing real values, your brand will be there with them. Users not just identifying with brand values, but maybe pushing this a little bit further by being a brand. And we're not talking about some form of social media where the user is the product that is being monetized. No. This is about inviting users to be part of your brand. So you design your brand and products within this brand space with consumer exploration in mind. You invite users into your brand magic circle. So all of it comes down to this. It's about how your brand, product, and service adds value to these virtual spaces and how these actions form relationships with people that can act and interact and express themselves within the space. And sometimes that means 3D avatars, collectibles, games, entertainment, but also, and especially, real products and services. So, to sum it up, we can look at the metaverse as a combination of ambient computing and social virtual worlds. Virtual means digital dimensions that do not really exist but carry real-world value. We can segment the metaverse landscape into 4 quadrants based on world-focused versus identity-focused and real-world versus constructed worlds. Progress in one quadrant will influence all other quadrants. And thus, for example, headsets do not matter as much as you think. The metaverse is where real people interact with each other, a hopefully safe environment to experiment and go beyond what they currently are. And always remember, identity is complex and messy. Increasingly smart and digital products and services will force organizations and brands to rethink their relationship and dynamics with customers, not just in the metaverse, but also in the real world. And you do this by intentionally designing spaces to encourage exploration, experimentation, and expression, and build governance systems around this to protect them. And governance is not just about punishing bad behavior, but also make a system that is intentionally inviting, inclusive, and accessible. Because who are we actually building all this stuff for? I hope we do it for everybody, enabling every person, thing, and space around the planet to enter the metaverse. So they can leave their mark, adding their voice and growing into their best selves. And yeah, probably they will bring chrome horses and raccoon animations and blinking text and memes and other design atrocities. But I think that another GeoCities moment would be awesome and the first hero experience of that coming metaverse. Thank you and take care.